Well, you're in for a treat today. We have a wonderful keynote speaker for you this morning, and as Lily said, a full day which will look at these truly historic events regarding the Middle East and North Africa. I think when history is written, this will definitely be one of the time periods that stand out, putting us above Charlie Sheen and Lindsay Lohan and those sorts of things. To that end, I'm very honored, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Mona Eltahawy. Mona was born in Egypt, and so she has a first-hand knowledge of the culture from whence the Egyptian Revolution came. She actually was educated there. She got her master's in journalism from the American University in Cairo. She is an Egyptian-American journalist, worked as a former correspondent for Reuters. She also wrote for the Saudi-owned publication Asharq al-Awsat until she was deemed too critical of the Mubarak regime. She's then, of course, taken up blogging, and that's how she first came to my attention. In some ways, therefore, she sort of embodies the freedom that's possible through technology, using computers and IT to blog about women's rights, about progressive Muslim issues, about human rights, about the yearnings for democracy and human rights in this region that for some reason has been a little bit behind in terms of development and in terms of human rights and women's rights in recent years. I believe that the reason that she's inspired so many of us who've become fans of her work is that she's almost reinvigorated mainstream media as well when she's appeared, because you can sense not only the extremely acute intelligence that she brings to her analysis of these issues, but also the passion and authenticity of her approach, which often just breaks through the traditional mind frames and concepts that we approach the region. So again, it's my great pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Mona Eltahawy.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Lily for inviting me to speak at the conference, and also to apologize to her for driving her crazy by never replying to email on time. But I hope she appreciates that these are special times and that I eventually replied. Thank you all for coming out so early and for your interest in the topic. I'm very glad to be here to share my excitement and reflections on what's been happening in the Middle East and North Africa. I'll focus mostly on Egypt because my experience is mostly with Egypt, but I'll also try to give examples from across the region. My talk will be basically the point that I've been trying to make since the uprisings and revolutions started in Tunisia and continue today in several countries, is that what we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa is not an overnight thing. People didn't just wake up on December the 17th in Tunisia and say we're going to rise up. People didn't just wake up on January the 25th in Cairo or Alexandria and say we're going to rise up. This is a process that has been in the works for many, many years, and it was rather a coming together of many different strands that had been operating often in isolation from each other, but found each other for various reasons and through various catalysts that brought them together, and that's what I'll share with you. But to give it more of a personal face, I'll share it with you through anecdotes and through my own experience, especially, as I said, with Egypt. My own politicization in Egypt began, I would say, at the end of the 80s when I moved back. My family left Egypt when I was a child, but I moved back when I was 21. And when I started journalism, one of the most memorable events that I attended was at the annual conference of something that was quite new at the time called the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights. It was part of an umbrella organization called the Arab Organization for Human Rights, and there were several human rights groups that were beginning, especially in larger countries in the region, that were pushing back against the abuses of various regimes. So I went to the annual event of the EOHR, and they introduced me to a woman who had come from a village somewhere in southern Egypt. And she knew about this conference because someone in the village had read a very small story about the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights, and they said to her, you have to go to Cairo because they can help you. And the reason that she needed help and the reason that she was there and was included in the annual report was because the police in her village had asked her to testify against a man they said had stolen a car. And she ran one of those kiosks that sell soda and cigarettes and newspapers. And she said, well, I don't know that man, so I'm not going to testify against him. Why should I ruin the life of someone who hasn't committed any crimes? The police insisted she testify. She refused to testify. So they took this woman who was in the middle of her 60s to the police station and sodomized her with the leg of a chair. And that's why she came to Cairo, because she demanded justice and she wanted someone to know her story. So this is what I mean about the personalizing the story. It's all been basically a process of the empowerment of the I, where various people and various groups who are standing up to the regime, who are fighting the regime, demand to be acknowledged as I, and demand to be counted as I, and who are saying that despite you, Hosni Mubarak, or despite you, at the time, Hafiz al-Assad, and now Bashar, your son, I count, despite this regime, especially for the majority of people in that part of the world who are younger than 30. 60% of people in the Middle East and North Africa are younger than 30. For all of those who have grown up with no other leaders than those regimes or those presidents that you are seeing now being forced to step down or whose regime is in danger, all those young people and others, not just young people, are basically rising up to say, I count. So there's that woman who left her village in southern Egypt to go to Cairo to say, I count. And the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights was documenting all these stories to say, I count. But who in Egypt was listening? It's a good thing that the people in her village saw that small story in the newspaper. I took that report home with me that included her story. At the time I was living with an uncle who was a doctor, so an educated man. And he asked to read the report, and the next morning he gave it back to me, and he looked distraught. He was just shaking his head, and he said, this happens in Egypt? And it was basically just one document after the other of these horrendous abuses that were happening in Egyptian jails, in Egyptian police stations, that the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights had documented, but very few other people in Egypt knew. Now, the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights inspired other human rights organizations, and these people, human rights activists in Egypt, have been working for a very long time under awful conditions, but very courageously documenting what's going on. So that was one strand of it, the human rights activist strand. Where social media come in, because my contention here with all these I's and the empowerment of the I and I count, where social media came in was that they connected the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights, the work of human rights organizations, the terrible abuses that are happening out there, but often in silence and under the cloak of the regime's all-encompassing power, is that social media now gave access to everybody to see what was happening. And so in 1989 or 1990, when I met this woman in Cairo who had been sodomized, all the way to 2006, when the famous blogger Wa'il Abbas, he's become very famous now for posting pictures of police abuse and police torture, he posted a video of the police in a police station in Cairo sodomizing a bus driver. So between that, 1990 and 2006, that's the connection that social media made, because no one had to come up from their village anymore and read a report and wonder what's going on in Egypt, because anyone who had access to the internet could now see it, because Wa'il put the video on his blog and on his YouTube channel. And because Wa'il put this video of the police sodomizing this bus driver who stood up to them as they tried to basically embezzle a group of bus drivers, they were demanding money from bus drivers. That video then alerted a journalist who covers human rights in Egypt and a human rights activist. And they tracked down the bus driver, and that's how they found him. Now, it was the other way around. They found the abused Egyptian through social media, because this one blogger, it was actually two bloggers, because there was another blogger who put the video, that made the connection. So that's where social media come in. Social media have been connecting people who have been working in isolation from each other and helping them create these networks that are then able together to stand up to the regime. So when this human rights journalist and activist found the bus driver in the video that Wa'il uploaded on YouTube and on his blog, they then persuaded him to take the police who tortured him to court. At first he had to go to jail for 3 months for obstructing justice, because that was the system, and unfortunately remains the system in Egypt. But after he served his time, he testified, and it was one of the first times where an Egyptian man testified bravely and openly about sexual assault at the hands of Egyptian police. And we don't have a system of jury. Our trial system in Egypt is not through juries, but through judges. And so you have 3 judges basically sitting on a table, and the head judge had a laptop on his desk, and one of the main pieces of evidence that was used against the police officers was that video that the police themselves took. I don't know if during the rest of the conference you'll be talking about this obsessive need to document everything that we do on social media and online, but even the police, even police who are torturing people obsessively, document themselves torturing people for various reasons. The police in this instance in Egypt filmed themselves torturing this man and sodomizing him because they wanted to humiliate him with other bus drivers and to warn other bus drivers not to stand up to them. So that's one instance where social media and the human rights activist community were able to come together online and form a collective, a mini network. And two of the police officers were eventually sent to jail for 3 years. Another instance of social media taking that out even more now, and especially when it comes to torture and human rights violations, happened last year in Egypt in the summer, on June the 6th, when a young businessman called Khalid Said was beaten to death by police. He was dragged out of an internet cafe in Alexandria and beaten to death because the police demanded to know where he got a video of police officers at a police station, basically with a block of hashish on the desk, dividing the drugs that they'd found between them and figuring out who should take how much of this hashish block, basically, or brick of hashish. Now, the difference between the woman who went to the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights in, say, 1989, 1990, and then the bus driver in 2006, whose abuse was uploaded onto YouTube, and now Khalid Said in the summer of last year, 2010, is to explain that difference is to explain to you why many apolitical Egyptians joined the January 25th protest and why they became politicized. Because Khalid Said looked like us. He looked like everyone in this room. He looked like everyone who uses Facebook. Because that poor woman in Egypt, literally poor, a woman living in poverty, often invisible, and that bus driver, they all belong to sectors that people could say, well, I don't belong to that group. I'm not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, so I'm okay. I'm not a political activist, so I'm okay. So even though whether the majority of Egyptians were aware that they lived under emergency law for every one of Hosni Mubarak's years in power or not, and whether they were aware of that report that I took home that shocked my uncle or not, they became very aware of it when Khalid Said was beaten to death, because his face was loaded. Young people across the board on Facebook, and the majority of Egyptians on Facebook, the number of Egyptians on Facebook now is probably more than 5 million, but by last summer it was 3 million, and Egypt was the #1 user of Facebook in the Arab world, and I think 23rd globally. The majority of those users on Facebook were young people, and the majority of them looked like Khalid Said. And so when they uploaded his picture, the shock came home. You do not have to be poor, you do not have to be invisible, you do not have to be a political activist to suffer at the hands of this regime, because someone like you could be beaten to death by this regime. And that's what happened with Khalid Said.